Bavaria, in the spring of 1945, carried the acrid smell of burned documents and abandoned equipment. The German soldiers had vanished into the countryside like smoke, leaving behind more than just military installations and half-destroyed tanks. Among the things they left were the women, dozens of them scattered across makeshift facilities that official records would never acknowledge existed. In one particular barracks on the outskirts of a small Bavarian village, 23-year-old Greta Weber stood with her spine pressed against rough wooden planks, her body automatically positioning itself between the sound of approaching engines and the two younger women who cowered behind her on narrow military cots. This protective stance had become as natural to her as breathing, developed over 4 years of learning that sometimes the only power you possessed was choosing which body the violence would strike first. The mechanical growl of engines grew louder, a deep, resonant thunder that made the entire structure vibrate. Greta could feel the trembling through her feet, through the walls against her back, through the very air that seemed to compress with each passing second. Beside her, 19-year-old Liesel had begun that terrible, anxious twisting of her dress fabric, fingers working the grey cotton with such repetitive intensity that permanent creases had formed in patterns that mapped her terror like a topographical guide to fear itself. The girl had been doing this for 3 years now, ever since they'd brought her from Hamburg, and Greta wondered if those creases would ever smooth out again, or if some kinds of damage left marks that outlasted the circumstances that created them. Ingrid Schneider maintained her rigid posture on the cot across the narrow room, her 28-year-old body holding itself with the kind of perfect alignment that betrayed her previous life as an educator. Even now, even here, she couldn't quite abandon the disciplined bearing she'd cultivated standing before classrooms full of children. Her hands gripped the edge of her thin blanket until her knuckles had gone white, bloodless, but her back remained straight, her shoulders squared, as if proper deportment might somehow protect her from whatever was coming through that door. She spoke with the precise diction of someone who had spent years teaching grammar and pronunciation, informing them that the Wehrmacht had evacuated before sunrise, abandoning everything in their retreat, including the women they'd kept locked in these barracks. The word everything hung in the stale air with particular weight, because all 3 of them understood that they themselves had been part of that inventory of abandoned military property. Through the single window, clouded with years of accumulated grime that no one had been permitted to clean, Greta watched dust clouds rise against the pale morning sky. She had been staring through that window for 4 years, marking the passage of seasons by the angle of sunlight and the colour of leaves on the distant trees. She'd been 19 when the soldiers came to her village, when they'd told her parents she was being recruited for essential war work, when her mother had actually believed them and packed a small bag with Greta's Sunday dress and her grandmother's leather-bound prayer book. That prayer book had disappeared during the brutal winter 2 years ago, traded to a kitchen worker for half a loaf of bread when hunger had become more pressing than faith. But Greta still remembered every prayer her grandmother had taught her, could still recite them perfectly in her mind, even though the words felt hollow now, like speaking a language that no longer had any meaning in the world she inhabited. The engine noise reached a crescendo that seemed to physically push against the walls, then suddenly cut off, leaving a silence so complete that Greta could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Male voices erupted in the quiet, shouting commands in that harsh foreign language she'd heard before but never learned. English. The Americans had arrived. She recognized the tone, even if the words themselves were incomprehensible. That particular timbre of military authority, of men establishing dominance over newly conquered territory. She'd heard German officers use similar voices when they'd first arrived at various postings, that sound of power being asserted without question or compromise. Greta whispered instructions to stay behind her, though she understood the futility of such directions. There was no escape route from this room, no back door or hidden passage. They'd learned years ago not to waste energy looking for exits that didn't exist. Instead, she focused on positioning her body correctly, assuming the careful posture that had kept her alive through countless encounters. Shoulders back but not defiant, Eyes lowered but not completely closed, hands loose at her sides, available but not reaching. It was a delicate calibration she'd spent months perfecting, the exact balance between compliance and complete submission, between being present enough to satisfy their need for acknowledgement and broken enough to avoid triggering their desire to break something further. Heavy boots crushed gravel outside, multiple sets of them moving with synchronized military precision. The sound grew closer, and Greta felt her body automatically arranging itself into that familiar configuration, that practiced readiness that had nothing to do with willingness and everything to do with survival. Behind her, Liesl made a small whimpering noise, the kind of sound that came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. The girl had been 16 when they'd brought her from the orphanage, told she was going to work in a munitions factory, given her hope for a legitimate future before stripping it away. She'd never developed the ability to hide her fear the way Greta and Ingrid had learned to do. Liesl's terror remained raw and visible, honest in a way that had become almost dangerous in their circumstances. Ingrid spoke in her teacher's voice, calm and measured, telling Liesl to breathe, just breathe, as if proper breathing technique might somehow make this bearable. The boot stopped directly outside their door, close enough that Greta could distinguish individual footsteps, could count the number of men gathered just beyond that thin barrier of wood. Male voices conversed in English, one asking a question, another responding. She caught a single word that she'd learned from guards who'd studied some English before the war, the word secure, and she understood enough to know they were discussing the building, cataloguing its contents, taking inventory. She'd become fluent over the years in the language of being counted and assessed, of being reduced to an item on a list that men with clipboards would review and initial. The door handle began to turn, metal scraping against rust with a long, slow squeal that seemed to stretch time itself. Greta straightened her spine further and lifted her chin just slightly, making herself clearly visible. She'd learned that it was better to be seen immediately than to be discovered hiding in corners or behind furniture. Men who found you hiding assumed guilt, assumed you had something shameful to conceal, assumed you needed to be taught a lesson about obedience and transparency. Better to stand in plain sight and accept whatever came next with at least the dignity of meeting it face forward. Sunlight exploded into the dim interior as the door swung open, creating a silhouette of a tall figure in an American uniform. Behind him, Greta could see more soldiers, younger men with faces that looked freshly shaved and uniforms that appeared crisp and clean. The smell that drifted in with them was startling in its unfamiliarity. Soap and starch and something else. Something that smelled like cleanliness itself, rather than the perpetual stink of sweat and tobacco smoke and unwashed bodies she'd grown accustomed to over the past 4 years. The officer in the doorway paused, his posture changing as he took in the scene before him. His gaze moved methodically from Greta to Liesl to Ingrid, and she watched his expression shift through several emotions in rapid succession. First came what looked like shock, then a kind of recognition, then something else entirely, something that resembled pity or sadness or regret. It was an expression she hadn't seen on a man's face in so long that she'd almost forgotten men could look at women that way, with something other than assessment of their utility. He turned and spoke quietly to the soldiers behind him, then did something completely unexpected. He stepped backward, moving away from the threshold rather than crossing it, maintaining the boundary between outside and inside without violating their space. His voice, when he spoke in careful, grammatically precise German with a noticeable accent, carried none of the tones she'd been bracing herself to hear. He told them they would not be harmed, that they were safe now, using the German word sicher with emphasis that suggested he wanted them to understand he meant it. The words floated in the air like something impossible, like promises that couldn't be trusted because trust itself had become a luxury none of them could afford. Greta felt something shift inside her chest, a tiny fracture in the defensive wall she'd constructed around her expectations. 4 years of experience had taught her not to believe promises from men in uniforms, But this man hadn't even entered their room, hadn't crossed that threshold, hadn't asserted his right to access their space. That small restraint felt enormous, unprecedented, almost incomprehensible. The truck bed had been lined with canvas that actually looked clean, that didn't carry the usual smell of diesel fuel or unwashed human bodies. Greta sat wedged between Liesl and Ingrid, their shoulders pressed together in the formation they'd maintained through countless transports over the years. But something was different this time. No one had separated them. No one had pointed at Liesl and dragged her toward a different vehicle. No one had shoved Ingrid toward the officer's transport. They were being kept together, and that single small mercy felt so unexpected, so unprecedented, that Greta almost couldn't process what it meant. The American soldier driving had helped them climb into the truck with careful respect, extending his hand palm upward and waiting for them to decide whether they wanted his assistance. When Liesl had instinctively flinched away from his offered help, he'd quietly placed a wooden crate beside the tailgate and stepped back, giving her another option without comment or judgment about her fear. Through the canvas opening at the back, Greta watched the Bavarian countryside roll past, fields torn up by tank treads and littered with abandoned equipment, but still managing to push up green spring growth through the scarred earth. Everyone said the war was ending. She'd heard it whispered among the guards in those final chaotic days, had seen it in the frantic way Wehrmacht officers had burned documents and fled before dawn. But endings had never meant freedom for women in their position. Endings just meant transitions, new masters replacing old ones, different uniforms attached to the same fundamental power dynamics. The sprawling military encampment that came into view looked like a temporary city, rows of canvas tents and wooden structures arranged in neat geometric lines, surrounded by wire fences that made Greta's stomach tighten with recognition. Fences meant confinement, regardless of who built them. The truck slowed and stopped in front of a low wooden building marked with a Red Cross symbol. The same soldier who'd driven them opened the tailgate and stepped back immediately, giving them space to climb down at their own pace without being rushed or handled. A tall sergeant emerged from the building, his uniform maintaining its crisp appearance despite the late afternoon heat. His face showed the weathering of years outdoors, but his eyes held kindness, and the deep lines around them suggested he spent more time smiling than frowning. He conversed briefly with the driver in English, then approached them with measured, careful steps that telegraphed his movements before he made them. His German carried a heavy accent but remained clear and comprehensible as he introduced himself as Sergeant Morrison and explained they would be staying in Building 7, which he described as clean and secure. Then he added something that made Liesl emit a small, involuntary sound of disbelief. He said no one would enter without their permission. Permission. The word felt alien, almost meaningless. They hadn't been asked permission for anything in so long that Greta had forgotten what it felt like to have choices that actually mattered, that could change outcomes, that gave them any control over their own circumstances. Morrison led them across the compound past rows of tents where American soldiers looked up from their evening activities. Some stared with obvious curiosity, others with expressions Greta couldn't quite interpret. But none of them called out crude suggestions. None of them made the gestures and signs she'd learned to expect from men who viewed women as available objects. They simply looked, sometimes nodded, and returned to their card games and letter writing as if the presence of women didn't automatically mean something could be taken or demanded. Building 7 turned out to be a converted barracks containing 6 cots arranged along the walls, each with a folded blanket and a small wooden crate serving as a makeshift bedside table. The blankets were wool, thick and clean, with the kind of softness that spoke of proper laundering and care. Greta ran her fingertips along the edge of one and felt something loosen in her chest at the simple luxury of clean fabric against her skin, fabric that didn't carry the smell of other people's sweat or the stains of other people's violence. Morrison pulled a sheet of paper from his jacket pocket and tacked it to the wall beside the door. The text was written in German, careful black letters arranged in a numbered list. Rule number 1 stated that no prisoner would be sexually assaulted or harmed. Rule number 2 specified that no soldier could enter the building without permission from the occupants. Rule number 3 explained that meals would be delivered at specific times and that they were not required to earn them, as if the act of eating might be understood as something freely given rather than something that came at a price. Ingrid stared at the posted rules with an intensity that suggested she was trying to decode a message written in cipher. She started to say something, then stopped, then tried again, as if the words she needed didn't exist in any vocabulary she'd ever learned. Her teacher's mind seemed unable to construct a framework that could make sense of rules that treated them like human beings with rights rather than property to be managed. A young guard appeared carrying a metal pot and 3 bowls. He couldn't have been much older than Liesel, with soft features that suggested he'd probably been working on some Midwestern farm a year ago before the war swept him across an ocean. He set the pot on the floor just inside the door and immediately stepped back, maintaining distance. His broken German announced that the pot contained hot soup for eating, and his cheeks flushed pink with the effort of communicating across the language barrier. When he made a move to hand a bowl directly to Liesel, she flinched so violently that she stumbled backward and collapsed onto one of the cots. The young guard froze immediately, his face draining of colour as he realised he'd frightened her. Morrison appeared beside him within seconds, speaking quietly in English before switching to German to remind him of protocols. "Announce yourself. Keep distance. Let them come to you." The young soldier, whom Morrison called Johnson, nodded rapidly and set the remaining bowls on the floor beside the pot. His whispered apology in German was earnest and distressed, repeating the phrase "no hurt" several times, as if he needed them to understand he would never deliberately frighten them. After the 2 men left, the 3 women sat in silence, staring at the steaming pot of soup. The smell rising from it suggested vegetables and meat, rich and nourishing. But more significant than its nutritional content was the fact that it had been given freely, without demands or expectations, without anyone naming a price for this kindness. Greta reached for a bowl with trembling fingers, half expecting someone to burst through the door and explain what they would need to do to earn this meal. No one came. Outside their window, she could hear American soldiers calling to each other in the gathering dusk, their voices carrying the easy camaraderie of men who felt safe enough to laugh, who slept without nightmares, who woke up each morning without wondering what fresh horror the day would bring. For the first time in 4 years, Greta allowed herself to consider the possibility that she might sleep safely too, that maybe tomorrow wouldn't bring the same cycle of fear and violation that had defined every yesterday. By the 3rd morning, the routine had begun to feel like something miraculous in its consistency. Breakfast arrived at precisely 8 o'clock, delivered by the young soldier Johnson, who had learned to knock twice, announce his presence clearly, and wait for explicit permission before entering their space. He placed the tray just inside the door with careful reverence, as if he understood he was handling something more fragile than dishes and food, as if the act of respecting their boundaries was itself something sacred that required his full attention and gentleness. Greta found herself waking before his knock each morning, her body still programmed for hypervigilance after 4 years of never knowing when someone might burst through a door with demands or violence. But now she lay on her cot in those early minutes, listening to Liesel's soft breathing and Ingrid's precisely controlled sleep patterns, marvelling at the absence of heavy boots in the hallway, the lack of crude voices demanding entrance, the simple, peaceful silence that felt almost too good to trust. She would lie there in the growing dawn light, testing the edges of this new reality, waiting for it to crack and reveal the familiar nightmare underneath. The infection in her shoulder had been festering for several weeks now, a souvenir from a particularly brutal Wehrmacht officer who had enjoyed leaving marks that would last, who had taken pleasure in creating visible evidence of his power. She'd hidden it skillfully, knowing that visible wounds often provoked men to either increased violence or disgust, neither of which improved her situation. But on the 4th morning, when she couldn't lift her right arm without a visible wince of pain, Liesel noticed the way she favoured her left side for everything. Liesel's voice carried that particular gentle quality she reserved for moments when she wasn't completely consumed by her own terror, as she pointed out that Greta was hurt. Before Greta could deflect or minimize or lie about the injury, Ingrid was beside her with the efficient assessment of someone who had spent years caring for students and children. Her teacher's authority came through as she announced that the shoulder needed medical attention, that infection was clearly present, that waiting would only make it worse. The idea of voluntarily asking for help from American soldiers felt impossible to consider seriously. Help from men had always come with a price, usually a terrible one. Medical attention from men had never been about healing, had always been about maintaining property in usable condition. But as the morning progressed and the throbbing in her shoulder intensified until even breathing hurt, Greta found herself considering the unthinkable possibility that maybe these men were different, that maybe the rules on their wall actually meant something. When Johnson arrived with their lunch, Ingrid stepped forward with the careful dignity that made her seem taller than her actual modest height. Her precise German requested medical help, then she attempted the English phrase she'd been practicing in quiet moments, the words "medical help, please" emerging in her accented but comprehensible pronunciation. Johnson's boyish face immediately creased with concern. He set down the food tray with quick efficiency and hurried away, returning within minutes accompanied by a compact Asian-American soldier who moved with the quiet capability of someone accustomed to medical emergencies and crisis situations. The medic introduced himself in German that was significantly better than Morrison's as Corporal Chen. His statement that he understood someone needed medical attention was delivered as fact rather than question, his demeanour professional and calm. When Greta reluctantly indicated her injured shoulder, Chen nodded once and opened his medical bag on the small table, but instead of immediately reaching toward her, he began pulling out supplies and explaining each item as he set it down in neat rows. "Antiseptic solution for cleaning," he announced, showing her a brown glass bottle. "Clean bandages. Antibiotic powder." He explained that the cleaning process might sting but would help prevent further infection. Then he paused, looked directly at her, and asked if it was acceptable for him to examine the injury to treat it properly. The question hung suspended in the air like something unprecedented in her experience. Acceptable to you, as if her acceptance mattered, as if she possessed the right to refuse a man who wanted to touch her, as if her body belonged to her rather than to whoever had the power to take it. Greta whispered yes, then cleared her throat and repeated it more firmly, claiming that small power, that tiny sovereignty over her own flesh. Chen's examination was clinical and gentle, his hands careful and his voice steady as he explained each step of the process. He described the infection as localized but significant, requiring thorough cleaning and antibiotics. He instructed her to keep it dry and covered for several days, speaking to her as if she were a competent adult capable of following medical instructions rather than property to be maintained. As he worked, cleaning the wound with methodical precision and careful attention to minimizing pain, Greta found herself studying his face for hidden motives, for signs of calculation about what this medical attention might entitle him to later. But his expression remained neutral and focused, showing no hunger, no expectation, no sense that this care came with strings attached or debts to be paid. When he finished securing the clean bandage with medical tape, he packed up his supplies and stood, but made no immediate move to leave. His quiet observation that the human body possessed remarkable healing capacity when given proper care and safety seemed aimed at something larger than just her infected shoulder. "Both are available to you here," he added, as if wanting her to understand that healing meant more than just physical wounds closing. After he left, the three women sat in stunned silence, processing what had just occurred. Finally, Liesel spoke with something that might have been wonder in her voice, pointing out that he had asked permission before touching Greta. Ingrid added that he had explained everything, every step, every supply, every reason, cataloguing the unprecedented experience with her teacher's mind that needed to organize and categorize information to understand it. That evening, when Morrison made his routine check on their welfare, Ingrid surprised herself by stepping forward to ask a question. Her careful German inquired whether the Red Cross carried letters, whether they helped locate family members. Morrison's weathered face softened visibly as he confirmed they did and asked if she had family she wanted to find. The words seemed to unlock something that had been held tightly closed for years as Ingrid spoke about her twin sons, how they would be 11 years old now, how they had been placed in American custody when she was taken. She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't articulate what had been done to her, but Morrison's understanding was evident in his expression. His gentle promise to get her the paperwork tomorrow, his explanation that the Red Cross had been very effective at reuniting families, seemed to open a door that had been sealed shut for so long that Ingrid had forgotten it existed. That night, for the first time since their arrival at the camp, the three women talked about something other than immediate survival. Liesl mentioned hesitantly that she had once harboured dreams of becoming a teacher like Ingrid. Greta spoke haltingly about her mother's garden, how roses had climbed the cottage walls each summer, how the scent of them had filled her childhood. Ingrid described her son's laughter, the way they had run to greet her each day after school, their identical faces lighting up with joy at seeing her. Their voices grew stronger as they spoke, losing the perpetual whispered quality that had become second nature in captivity. Outside their window, the American camp settled into its evening routine, the sounds of safety and normalcy drifting through the spring air like music from another world, a world they were just beginning to believe they might be permitted to rejoin. For the first time in years, tomorrow felt like something to anticipate rather than something to simply endure until it ended. The film reel arrived on a morning when grey clouds hung low over the camp, when the spring air carried more chill than warmth, when the light itself seemed muted and uncertain. Greta noticed the change in the atmosphere before she understood its cause. Conversations stopped abruptly when soldiers walked past their building. The easy laughter that had become familiar background noise grew sparse and strained, replaced by heavy silences and tense low voices. Morrison appeared at their door just after breakfast, his usually steady demeanour replaced by something heavier, something that weighed on his shoulders like physical burden. Behind him stood a soldier Greta hadn't seen before, a compact man with hard eyes and shoulders that seemed to carry invisible weight, whose entire posture suggested he was braced against something terrible. Morrison's introduction identified him as Corporal Sullivan, explained he would be working with their unit for the next few weeks. Sullivan's gaze swept over the three women with an expression Greta recognised from years of reading men's faces for signs of danger. This wasn't the clinical assessment of Medic Chen or the gentle concern of young Johnson. This was evaluation, judgment, the look of someone trying to determine guilt or innocence, trying to decide whether they were victims or perpetrators or something in between. Sullivan's stiff nod toward Ingrid as the eldest, his formal mom, carried an undertone that made Liesl unconsciously step closer to Greta for protection. After the two men left, an uncomfortable silence settled over Building 7 like dust. The easy routine they had begun to trust suddenly felt fragile, as if a single suspicious look could shatter the safety they had barely begun to accept. The change became more pronounced over the following days. Guards who had grown accustomed to casual, friendly conversation now maintained professional distance, their interactions limited to necessary communications. Johnson still delivered their meals with careful courtesy, but his boyish smile seemed forced now, performed rather than genuine, and he avoided meeting their eyes directly, as if looking at them had become uncomfortable or shameful. Corporal Chen finally explained what was happening when he arrived to check Greta's healing shoulder. He carried his usual medical bag, but his typically calm demeanour seemed strained, his movements less fluid than before. As he examined her wound, he spoke quietly about new information that had reached the camp about the concentration camps, about film footage and documentation, about American soldiers processing what they had seen. His words were careful, measured, but Greta felt her chest tighten with understanding. They had heard whispers about the camps over the years, terrible rumors that seemed too horrific to believe, stories that sounded like propaganda designed to demonize the regime. But whispers and rumors were different from documented reality, different from film footage and eyewitness accounts, different from official military reports that couldn't be dismissed as exaggeration or lies. Chen continued applying fresh bandages with gentle precision as he explained that some of the men were struggling to understand the difference between victims and perpetrators, that it was difficult for them to process the idea that German women could suffer under the same system that had committed such atrocities, that nationality and guilt had become confused in their minds in ways that made clear thinking difficult. That afternoon, Sullivan appeared at their door again, but this time without Morrison's moderating presence to temper his anger or soften his approach. He carried a manila folder and wore the expression of someone fulfilling an unpleasant duty, someone who didn't want to be there but felt compelled by obligation or anger or some complex mixture of emotions he couldn't quite name or control. His heavily accented German announced that he needed to ask them some questions, but his tone suggested that these questions were actually accusations waiting to be confirmed, judgments already made and simply requiring verification. Ingrid straightened to her full height, assuming the authoritative posture that had once commanded classrooms full of children, her spine rigid with the dignity she refused to surrender even now. Sullivan opened the folder and pulled out several photographs, grainy black and white images that made Liesel gasp and turn away immediately, that made even Ingrid's carefully maintained composure crack visibly. The photographs showed emaciated figures behind barbed wire, mass graves, children with hollow eyes that had seen things no child should witness, evidence of systematic murder and deliberate dehumanization. His question about what they knew, what they saw, was delivered with barely controlled anger that vibrated in his voice like a plucked string. The photographs lay between them like formal accusations, like evidence in a trial where they were the defendants. Greta stared at the documented proof of humanity's capacity for evil and felt something collapse inside her chest, not surprise exactly, but terrible confirmation. She had known evil intimately, had lived with it pressed against her skin for 4 years. But seeing it documented, made official, recorded on film and distributed to military personnel somehow made her own survival feel like complicity, like she had been part of this system rather than destroyed by it. Her whispered response that they knew nothing, that they knew they didn't matter, emerged barely audible. Sullivan pressed harder, his anger fully visible now as he insisted that the camps had been all over Germany, that people had to know, had to see, had to understand what was happening. His implication was clear: willful ignorance was itself a form of guilt, and survival under such a regime made every German suspect. Liesel began to shake uncontrollably, her fragile stability crumbling under the weight of Sullivan's accusations. Her broken explanation that they had been told they were lucky, that they could have been sent to work camps instead, that they thought work camps meant factory labour, revealed the lies they had been fed and believed because believing was easier than accepting the full horror of their reality. Ingrid's teacher instincts activated even as her own composure threatened to break completely. Her explanation came out with bitter precision, describing how they had been told they were serving the Führer's Reich, how they were told their sacrifice kept worse things from happening to other women, how they believed they were the price paid to protect others from even more terrible fates. The bitter irony of having been told their own exploitation was somehow protective hung in the air like poison. Sullivan stared at them with unconcealed disgust that felt like a physical blow, like being struck across the face. His question about how they could know they weren't just as guilty as the rest, just as complicit in the regime's crimes, just as responsible for the horrors documented in those photographs, landed with the weight of a verdict already decided. The question hung suspended in the air like smoke, like poison gas, like something that would contaminate everything it touched. Greta felt years of carefully constructed survival mechanisms crumble around her like walls made of sand. The shame she had fought so hard to contain came flooding back with renewed force, mixed now with the terrible knowledge that while they had been trapped in their own hell, others had suffered and died in ways that made their own torture seem almost merciful by comparison, as if there was a hierarchy of horror and they had somehow gotten off easily. "Maybe we are guilty," Greta said finally, the words scraping her throat raw like broken glass. "Maybe surviving makes us complicit. Maybe we should have died instead of accepting what was done to us." Sullivan gathered up his photographs and stood, leaving them with their shame and the horrible certainty that their brief taste of dignity had been a cruel illusion, that German women had no right to compassion or care or basic human treatment when other Germans had committed such unspeakable crimes. They huddled together on the cots as darkness fell, no longer 3 women healing from trauma, but 3 conspirators in history's greatest crime, marked by their survival as surely as if guilt had been tattooed across their foreheads in indelible ink. Outside their window, the American camp continued its evening routines, but now those ordinary sounds felt distant and condemning, as if even the spring air itself carried judgment against them for the crime of being German, for the crime of surviving when so many others had died. The silence in Building 7 acquired weight and substance over the following days, pressing down on them like a physical thing, like gravity had increased somehow. For 3 days after Sullivan's interrogation with his terrible photographs and his more terrible questions, the women barely spoke to each other, moving through their routines like ghosts haunting the space of their own lives, like they were already dead but somehow hadn't realized it yet. They accepted their meals with downcast eyes and whispered thanks that felt inadequate, waiting for the inevitable moment when someone in authority would realize the truth about what they were and take away even these small mercies they didn't deserve. Greta found herself mentally cataloguing every kindness she had received since arriving at Camp Lucky Strike, preparing to surrender each one as payment for the crime of surviving when others had not, when children had starved behind barbed wire, when innocent people had been murdered systematically while she had merely been raped and beaten. The clean blankets that smelled of soap instead of fear, the gentle medical care that treated her as human rather than property, the simple dignity of being asked for permission before being touched, all of it felt stolen now, luxuries she had no right to claim when her very existence was evidence of Germany's guilt. Liesel had retreated into manic silence, that terrible internal space she had once inhabited constantly before beginning to emerge at Camp Lucky Strike. She rocked slightly on her cot, staring at the wall with unseeing eyes that looked past the wooden planks into some internal landscape of horror. Ingrid sat rigid and watchful, her teacher's mind working frantically to find some logical framework that could make sense of guilt and innocence in a world where both concepts had become meaningless, where survival itself was suspect and death might have been the only moral choice. When Morrison appeared in their doorway on the 4th morning, flanked by Sullivan and carrying an official-looking document, Greta felt her heart drop toward her stomach, felt her body prepare for the blow she had been expecting. This was the moment of reckoning, the official judgment, the stripping away of their temporary sanctuary, and the confirmation of what Sullivan's photographs had already proven, that German women who survived the war were inherently suspect, complicit by virtue of breathing German air while others suffocated. But instead of reading charges or demanding confessions or explaining their punishment, Morrison stepped forward with the same careful gentleness he had shown since their first day at the camp. Sullivan stood behind him, his face displaying conflicted emotions that seemed to war with each other in real time, anger and pity and shame and confusion, all visible in the tension of his jaw and the tightness around his eyes. Morrison's quiet statement that what happened in those camps wasn't their responsibility, that what happened to them wasn't their fault either, seemed to come from some impossible place where logic and mercy intersected. Greta felt the words hit her chest like physical blows, each syllable challenging the guilt she had wrapped around herself like protective armor, like the only thing that made sense in a senseless world. Morrison turned slightly to include Sullivan in his gaze, to make sure the other soldier was hearing this clearly. His statement that these women had survived hell, that they weren't the enemy but rather the evidence of what the Allies had been fighting against, hung in the air with the weight of official military judgment, with the authority of someone who outranked Sullivan and was using that rank to correct a moral error. Sullivan's face crumpled slightly, as if some internal dam had finally given way under pressure, as if he had been holding something back and could no longer maintain the effort. He looked at Greta with eyes that seemed to see her clearly for the first time, not as a representative of German guilt or a symbol of enemy complicity, but as a young woman whose childhood had been stolen, whose innocence had been weaponized against her, whose survival had required her to endure things that should never happen to any human being. His question about her age when they took her emerged in halting German, his voice stripped of the accusation that had defined their previous interactions. The number 19 emerged from Greta's mouth as a whisper, feeling both ancient and impossibly young, a reminder that she had been a teenager when this started, younger than Liesel was now, still believing the world made sense and promises could be trusted. Sullivan closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, something fundamental had shifted in his expression. His whispered exclamation in English, his struggle to find German words to explain, revealed something breaking open inside him. He mentioned his sister, 19 years old, at home in Ohio, and suddenly Greta understood that he was seeing her clearly for the first time, seeing past her nationality to her personhood, past her survival to her humanity. He extended his hand toward Greta, not to take anything from her but to offer support as she stood from the cot, the gesture small but monumental, the first time in 4 years that a man had reached for her with the intention of lifting her up rather than pulling her down, of helping rather than hurting. His apology emerged with a crack in his voice that suggested real emotion underneath, real recognition of having caused harm. He mentioned his brother who had died fighting this system, admitted he had thought anger would somehow honor that sacrifice, but recognized now that his brother would be ashamed of him for directing that anger at victims instead of perpetrators, for causing additional suffering to women who had already suffered more than anyone should have to endure. Morrison opened the document in his hands, revealing not charges or condemnation, but Red Cross paperwork and repatriation forms, bureaucratic evidence of a different kind. His gentle announcement that they had located Ingrid's sons hit the room like a thunderbolt. The boys were safe in American custody in Munich, healthy and asking about their mother every single day, waiting for her. Ingrid's careful composure finally shattered completely, not from pain or shame, but from the foreign sensation of hope fulfilled, of maternal love rewarded rather than punished, of prayers answered that she had stopped daring to pray. She wept with the kind of crying that comes from the deepest places, from relief and joy and the sudden release of years of wondering whether her children were alive or dead, safe or suffering, whether they remembered her or had forgotten her face. Liesel reached for Ingrid with shaking hands, and for the first time in days, her young face showed something other than terror or shame or that terrible blank staring. She looked almost hopeful, as if witnessing Ingrid's joy reminded her that good things could still happen, that the world might contain mercy as well as cruelty. Morrison continued explaining that they would all be transferred to the repatriation centre the following week, that the process of returning them to their families or helping them rebuild their lives would begin soon. But before he finished with the practical details, he paused and looked at each of them in turn, his expression carrying the weight of absolute conviction, the certainty of someone who had made a decision about what was right and intended to stand by it, regardless of what anyone else thought. His instruction to tell people what they saw at Camp Lucky Strike, to tell the world that some Americans had remembered they were human when the rest of the world had forgotten, gave them a mission, a purpose, a reason to transform their suffering into something meaningful. Greta felt something shift inside her chest, not the cracking of breaking, but the settling of pieces finding their proper places after years of displacement. She had been 19 years old when they stole her life, when they took her childhood and her innocence and her faith in humanity. But she was 23 now, and 23 was old enough to choose what to do with whatever remained of her life, with whatever future she could build from the ruins of the past. Her voice grew stronger with each word as she told Morrison and Sullivan to tell their families, to tell anyone who would listen, that 3 German women would spend the rest of their lives proving that mercy was stronger than cruelty, that kindness could survive even in the aftermath of the greatest evil humanity had ever created, that healing was possible even for wounds that seemed fatal. Outside their window, the spring afternoon carried the sounds of men preparing for peace rather than war, the noise of a world that was slowly, painfully, beginning to rebuild itself from the ashes of destruction. And for the first time since liberation, since those American tanks had rolled through the smoke and dust, the future felt like something worth walking toward rather than something to simply endure, moment by moment, until it finally ended.